The shock did not begin in Washington. It began the moment Canada decided it would not just absorb pressure, smile politely, and move on. Instead, it hit back where it hurts most: price. Aluminium, one of the quiet metals that holds up modern life, suddenly became the center of a much bigger fight. This is not just about factory material. This is about cars, planes, construction, cans, power grids, defense systems, and the hidden skeleton of industry itself. When Canada raised aluminium prices in response to Trump-era tariff pressure, it sent a message far louder than any speech. It said the old rules are over. It said pressure will now be answered with pressure. And it said America may have started a trade war, but it cannot control how the other side chooses to fight it. That is why Washington was caught off guard, not because Canada is weak, not because Canada lacks options, but because many in the American political class still treat Canada like a predictable partner that will complain quietly and then adjust. This time, that calculation appears to have failed. Instead of folding under tariff stress, Canada used one of the most effective tools in economic conflict: pricing power. When the cost of a key industrial input goes up, everything built on top of it starts to shake. Manufacturers feel it first, suppliers feel it next, consumers feel it last, but by the time regular people notice, the damage is already moving through the system. That is what makes this moment dangerous. Tariffs sound technical, almost boring until they begin to move through real life. A tariff is simply a tax placed on imported goods. Governments use it to protect local industries or punish foreign rivals, but tariffs are never just numbers on paper. They change decisions. They change contracts. They change where companies buy, where factories invest, and how much ordinary people pay. So when one side throws up tariffs and the other side responds by pushing prices higher, this is not a neat policy debate. It becomes a chain reaction. That reaction can spread across borders in days and through economies in months. And aluminium is the perfect battlefield for this kind of retaliation because it sits in the middle of so many industries. It is light, strong, and everywhere. It goes into pickup trucks, fighter jets, apartment windows, power lines, beverage cans, machine parts, and shipping equipment. It is one of those materials people rarely think about until the price jumps. Then suddenly, nobody can ignore it. A small rise in aluminium cost can become a bigger rise in transport costs, building costs, packaging costs, and manufacturing costs. That is why this move carries far more weight than it seems at first glance. If this pressure keeps building, it will not stay inside trade offices and political press rooms. It will spill into the market, then into paychecks, then into public anger. If you can already feel how much bigger this is than a metal price story, stay with this all the way through, because the deeper strategy behind this move is where things get even more serious. What makes Canada's move so sharp is that it turns a defensive problem into an offensive one. Trump-style tariffs were built on the idea of leverage. The idea was simple: make foreign goods more expensive, force industries to come home, and show political strength. On paper, it sounds aggressive and effective, but there is a hidden weakness inside that strategy. It assumes the country being targeted does not have its own leverage. Canada just reminded everyone that it does. If the United States wants to make entry into its market more painful, Canada can make access to its materials more costly. That changes the balance fast. This is where the real conflict stops being symbolic and starts becoming strategic. Canada is not only reacting emotionally, it is choosing the pressure point carefully. Aluminium is not a luxury product. It is not some optional import that can be swapped out overnight. Supply chains do not move like politicians talk. They move slowly, expensively, and with huge risk. A car plant cannot just wake up tomorrow and redesign its sourcing system. A builder cannot instantly replace metal components at scale. A defense contractor cannot casually change suppliers for sensitive materials. These systems are deeply connected, and Canada knows that. Raising prices does not just send a political message, it creates friction inside the American industrial machine. That is why the surprise in Washington matters. Surprise in geopolitics is rarely about the act itself, it is about misreading the other side. Many American strategists likely expected anger, headlines, maybe symbolic retaliation. What they may not have expected was a move that directly raises the cost of downstream industry inside the United States. That is a very different level of confrontation. It says Canada is no longer satisfied with moral outrage or diplomatic language. It is willing to use the structure of trade itself as a weapon, calmly, precisely, and that makes this harder to dismiss. There is also a political reason this hits so hard. Tariffs are often sold to voters as patriotic toughness. Leaders present them as proof they are standing up for the country. But price hikes are harder to spin once factories begin complaining, builders begin cutting margins, and households begin paying more. A government can celebrate tariffs in a speech. It cannot easily explain why canned goods, car parts, renovation materials, and industrial components are suddenly getting more expensive. That is where trade war rhetoric runs into economic reality, and reality tends to win. Drop a comment if you think Canada's response is smart pressure or a risky escalation, because this is one of those moments where a trade decision can quickly become a political earthquake. But the deeper layer here is not just Canada versus Trump or Ottawa versus Washington. It is the slow breakdown of trust between countries that are supposed to be close allies. That is what makes this so unsettling. These are not distant rivals separated by oceans and ideology. These are neighboring economies tied together by geography, energy, manufacturing, transport, and decades of cooperation. When this kind of pricing retaliation starts between countries this interconnected, it is a sign something larger is shifting beneath the surface. The old assumption was that North American trade would remain broadly stable, even during political disputes. That assumption now looks fragile. Once trust weakens, every economic decision begins to change shape. Companies start building backup plans, investors begin pricing in political risk, governments look for alternate suppliers, trade ministers start thinking less about efficiency and more about resilience, which means safety, and safety costs money. A factory buying from the cheapest source is one thing. A factory buying from the safest source is another. That shift sounds small, but it changes everything. It means businesses stop chasing pure profit and start preparing for disruption. It means supply chains get thicker, slower, and more expensive. In plain words, the world becomes less smooth and more defensive. This matters especially now because the global economy is already on edge. Inflation fear never fully disappears. Housing costs remain painful in many places. Shipping networks have already lived through years of shocks. Wars, sanctions, political disputes, and industrial rivalry have trained companies to expect sudden disruption. So when a major supplier like Canada signals it is ready to use pricing as retaliation, markets hear more than one national dispute. They hear a warning. They hear that another part of the global system is becoming political. And when basic industrial inputs become political, no sector feels fully safe. For ordinary people, that sounds distant until the ripple reaches daily life. It may start with aluminium, but the consequences do not stay inside a warehouse. The cost can move into beverage packaging, home repairs, replacement windows, electrical infrastructure, appliances, and transportation. Businesses facing higher input costs usually have only a few choices. They absorb the loss, which hurts profits. They cut investment, which hurts jobs. Or they pass the price on, which hurts consumers. Often they do all three in different ways. That is why trade wars never stay at the top, they flow downward. Think about a small manufacturer already dealing with higher wages, expensive energy, and uncertain demand. Now add more costly aluminium. Suddenly every quote becomes harder to make, every contract becomes riskier, every delay becomes more dangerous. A company that wanted to hire may now wait. A company that wanted to expand may now freeze. A company that wanted to keep prices stable may now have no choice but to increase them. This is how macroeconomics, the big national stuff, quietly becomes micro-pain inside towns and families. And then there is the public mood. Voters can tolerate grand strategy only for so long. Once economic conflict starts feeling personal, patience drops. If leaders claim they are protecting the nation but people feel poorer, angrier, and less secure, the political story changes fast. That is why aluminium matters politically. Not because voters obsess over metal markets, but because they react to cost, stress, and instability. Trade wars often begin with flags. They end with receipts. If you're still here, hit like on the video, because stories like this rarely stay in the headlines long enough for people to see the full chain of consequences before the next crisis arrives. Now comes the part that should really worry policymakers. Canada's move may not stay isolated. If one close partner learns that targeted price pressure gets attention, others may study the same playbook. That does not mean every country will copy the exact tactic, but the lesson is powerful. If Washington uses tariffs as leverage, other governments can respond through cost, access, delay, regulation, or supply control. In other words, they do not need to fight America on America's chosen battlefield. They can choose their own. And that makes the next round of trade conflict far more unpredictable. This is how economic power is changing in the modern world. For years, many people thought power was mostly about military force, big speeches, and visible sanctions. But the real pressure points are often quieter. They sit inside logistics, minerals, semiconductors, energy routes, and industrial materials. Nations that control key links in those chains have leverage, even against stronger military powers. Canada may not be trying to rewrite the global order overnight, but by using a strategic material in a retaliatory way, it is participating in a much larger trend. The world is moving from open efficiency to strategic control. That shift is huge. It means countries are no longer thinking only about trade volume. They are thinking about dependence. Who needs whom more? Who can raise costs faster? Who can survive a standoff longer? Who can make pain politically unbearable on the other side? These are the questions shaping the new economic age. And once governments start thinking like that, trade stops being a simple exchange. It becomes a contest of endurance, a contest of nerves, a contest of pressure. This is also why the phrase "Washington surprised" is so revealing. Surprise does not happen when a rival strikes. Surprise happens when a partner stops acting like a partner under pressure. That is what changes the emotional temperature of the whole story. It means policymakers may have underestimated how far frustration had grown. It means even countries with close cultural, economic, and security ties are now more willing to push back bluntly when they feel cornered. That should send a chill through every capital watching this unfold. While politicians will talk about national strength, boardrooms are likely talking about something else entirely: uncertainty. Uncertainty is poison for investment. A factory can survive bad news better than unstable rules. Investors can model higher costs better than political volatility. But when nobody knows whether tariffs will rise, prices will jump, retaliation will spread, or supply will tighten, capital gets nervous. Projects get delayed, hiring slows, risk premiums rise, everybody waits. That waiting period can do real damage even before the worst-case scenario ever arrives. Share this with someone who still thinks trade wars are just about headlines and tough talk, because the real battlefield is usually hidden inside contracts, factories, and supply chains. And what could happen next is where the stakes widen even more. If the United States chooses to answer this move with more pressure, the cycle can intensify. More tariffs could invite more retaliation. More retaliation could trigger more price shocks. That could push companies to search for alternative suppliers, but those alternatives may be costlier, farther away, or less reliable. The result would not be stability, it would be fragmentation. Trade that once flowed smoothly across a trusted border would start rerouting through a messier and more expensive map. That kind of rerouting sounds technical, but it can reshape regions. Industrial hubs rise and fall based on access, cost, and predictability. If companies begin to doubt the long-term stability of North American material flows, they may rethink production footprints. Some could move capacity. Some could diversify abroad. Some could keep domestic operations but pay more for resilience. None of those choices are free. And none of them happen without affecting jobs, tax revenue, and local economies. In other words, a trade clash over aluminium can become a slow restructuring of industrial geography. There is also the issue of credibility. When leaders threaten tariffs, they want other countries to believe resistance is too expensive. But if Canada proves that pushback can be sustained and can inflict real discomfort, then the fear factor behind tariff politics weakens. That matters beyond one dispute. It affects future negotiations with allies, rivals, and swing states that do business with both sides. Power is not just having tools. Power is convincing others that your tools will work better than theirs. Once that image cracks, every future confrontation gets harder. And that is why this event may signal something much bigger than a bilateral spat. It may be part of the broader end of the old globalization bargain. For decades, many governments acted as though deep trade links would reduce conflict and make economics less political. Instead, the opposite is now happening. Those same links are being turned into leverage. Dependence is being studied like a vulnerability. Interconnection is no longer always seen as peace. Sometimes it is seen as exposure. That is a major mental shift, and once it takes hold, it is hard to reverse. For Canada, this is not only about answering pressure. It is about proving that middle powers, countries not at the top of the global hierarchy but still highly capable, can defend themselves in a harsher economic era. For the United States, it is a warning that even close partners are adapting to a more transactional world. And for everyone else watching, it is a live lesson in how modern power really works. Not always through tanks, not always through speeches. Often through pricing, supply, and timing. If you want more breakdowns like this that connect the daily headlines to the real power shifts underneath them, subscribe now, because these are the stories that quietly reshape the world before most people realize what changed. The human side of this story should not be ignored either. Behind every tariff and every price adjustment are workers who did not design any of this. There are truck drivers moving materials across borders, plant workers trying to keep shifts stable, construction crews dealing with changing quotes, and families already squeezed by rising living costs. Big economic conflict is often narrated like a game of strategy, but on the ground it feels more like uncertainty. People ask whether their job is safe, whether their company will cut hours, whether the next bill will be higher, whether leaders actually know how far this can go. That gap between political theatre and lived reality is where anger grows. Governments often speak in terms of national pride, retaliation, and strength. Citizens experience delay, confusion, inflation, and pressure. The longer that gap remains, the more unstable politics becomes. That is another reason Canada's move matters. It exposes the cost of escalation in a way that speeches cannot hide. It turns abstract trade language into consequences that can show up in payroll decisions and household budgets. Once that happens, the public no longer sees a strategic contest, it sees a squeeze. And yet, from another angle, Canada's move may be exactly what some leaders believe is necessary. If you keep accepting pressure without raising the cost to the other side, you teach them that coercion works. In that sense, higher aluminium prices are not just retaliation, they are deterrence. A warning meant to say that future tariff threats will not be painless. That logic is cold, but it is common in statecraft. The problem is that deterrence in economics is messy. It does not land cleanly on the intended target, it spreads, it drifts, it loops back. That looping effect is what makes trade conflict so difficult to control. One side wants leverage, the other side wants respect, businesses want predictability, consumers want affordability, politicians want credit without blowback, markets want clarity. Nobody gets exactly what they want once escalation begins. The result is a strange mix of toughness and vulnerability, where every player tries to look strong while quietly managing damage. That is the real atmosphere of modern economic warfare. It is not clean victory, it is managed disruption. And somewhere inside that disruption, a bigger truth is emerging. The age when economic interdependence automatically meant restraint is fading. Countries now believe they must be prepared to weaponize access, cost, and supply before someone else does it first. That is a darker world, a more suspicious world, a world where even close neighbours calculate risk in harder ways. Canada's aluminium move, whether temporary or lasting, fits that new reality perfectly. It is not just a response. It is a sign of the times. Stay until the end and let me know where you think this goes next, because the next move will tell us whether this was a warning shot or the start of something much bigger. If this keeps escalating, North America could enter a period where economic planning is driven less by efficiency and more by strategic fear. That may protect some sectors in the short term, but it also raises costs across the board. Protection sounds strong. Fragmentation feels expensive. That is the paradox leaders keep running into. They want secure supply chains, but secure usually means duplicated, slower, and pricier. They want domestic industry, but domestic expansion takes time, money, labor, and political patience. They want leverage, but leverage invites counter-leverage. Every move closes one weakness and opens another. That is why this story feels larger than a metal dispute. It carries the tension of a power shift. The old assumption that America could dictate trade pressure without serious blowback is being tested. The old image of Canada as a permanently soft responder is being tested. The old faith that close allies would avoid this level of economic friction is being tested. And once assumptions begin to fail, the entire system feels less stable. That is, investors hesitate, governments harden, and publics grow uneasy. That is when small policy moves begin casting long shadows. In the end, this is not only about aluminium prices. It is about who can bear pain, who can impose it, and who misjudge the other side. It is about how fast a tariff can become a political signal, then an industrial shock, then a symbol of a changing world. Canada's response may look narrow on the surface, but beneath it sits a blunt message. Pressure will be answered, dependence cuts both ways, and even the closest partners are no longer willing to play by old assumptions when their economic interests are on the line. That is why Washington was surprised. And that is why this moment may be remembered as more than a trade clash. It may be remembered as one more sign that the era of easy economic trust is ending. and a harsher contest of leverage has already begun. If this breakdown gave you a clearer view of what is really unfolding, subscribe, like the video, and share your take, because the next chapter of this power struggle may arrive faster than anyone expects.